the one thing I can tell you is that we are going through precisely the same debates here in South Africa. And the politics around the energy transition is very live. We have people lined up on both sides of the debate. We have, the big issue for us is the pace at which we decarbonize and what the future looks like for our coal mining areas. And I want to show you a few slides, if I may, just to highlight the point for you. This is me. This is the organization I represent. We are a multi-stakeholder commission. We were set up by the president a year ago. And I am the executive director. I basically run the commission. For us, the just transition is the key to the whole climate transition. It's in a sense a foundational position for our policy work. We've put it into the draft legislation that's in front of our parliament. So. And we define it as a shift to low carbon, climate resilient, and ecologically sustainable economy and society, with the goals of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. And we pull out three aspects of justice that we focus on. The one is procedural justice, which is about including people that are most affected by the transition in decision-making around it. We talk about distributive justice, which is making sure that there's a fair distribution of climate risks and the resources and opportunities to respond to those risks. And we talk about restorative justice, which is about the measures and the transitional arrangements we put in place to compensate impacted groups and make sure that they have jobs and livelihoods into the future. And we're right now, I mean, as we speak, we're in the process of putting the policy framework on the table for this. We're calling it a framework for the just transition, and it's meant to be a practical guide with some short and medium-term policy interventions. This is a map of our country which shows you where our coal mining areas are. I mean, we're, like you, blessed, blessed and cursed with one. I think our coal fields are, they're certainly amongst the largest in the world. There's this vast area to the east of Johannesburg, and it underlies the Mpumalanga province and parts of the northern province, Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal, also in the Free State and some in the Eastern Cape. And our energy model for decades, I mean, for at least the last 50, 60 years, you know, we build these huge coal-fired power stations on top of coal mines, and we burn that coal to make our power. And that has resulted in probably, I think we are, if you look at the carbon intensity of our exports, we are certainly amongst the most intensive in the world. The carbon intensity of our exports is about twice that of China, and it's 75% more than yourselves. And that is a risk. The focus at the moment, and one of the big debates, is how much of an economic risk that places on us. And you know, we're following what our trading partners, particularly our friends in the EU, are doing. I mean, you know, everyone's been signing up to net zero commitments, as have you, as have other developing countries, and as have us. And we're seeing those commitments being followed through with some form of attempt to prevent carbon leakage. I mean, the EU is talking about their carbon border tax adjustment mechanism. The US is coming up with some other arrangement. But in one form or another, there is a carbon price that will be injected into the world economy. And what we don't want is to be left at the end of the transition, having to make an extremely painful adjustment and facing mass unemployment and a declining, uncompetitive economy. So, we've been fairly bold in thinking how to respond to this. Our focus is on getting our economy to net zero somewhere around mid-century. I know you've got a net zero target for 2070, China for 2060. We think we're going to need to be net zero earlier than that. Certainly in terms of carbon, other greenhouse gases, we can talk about getting to net zero at a later date. And we've modeled this very carefully. I mean, we've looked at economic impact, we've looked at what's a feasible trajectory. And you would have noticed in our latest NDC, we came up with a more ambitious, it's a range of emissions, which is between 420 and 350 megatons of CO2 per annum. Cabinet adopted our recommendations in the build-up to COP26. This is the practical implications of that trajectory up to 2035. So, we're intending, we have a whole raft of coal-fired power stations that are ending their useful economic life. They are now falling below a 40% utilization rate, and it's uneconomic for us to keep running those coal-fired power stations. It's costing more on maintenance and repair, and we now have air quality provisions being imposed. So it's actually going to pay the country to pull those power stations off. And you can see the rate along the bottom at which we have to decommission our coal-fired power stations. And on the top, you can see what we're needing to replace it with. And we've mapped out, we've got incredible renewable resources in the country. Like some of the best solar, very good wind resources. We need to balance the grid with gas, and we don't yet have utility scale batteries at the level that'll be coming in the 2030s. So certainly now, 2020s, early 2030s, we're going to be needing a big slug of gas. And we're overbuilding on that. So we're doing 50 gigawatts of new capacity to replace the 22 gigawatts that are being pulled off in terms of our generation. This is going to have employment effect. And, I've shown you here on the slide, we've got different models that we use. The one on the left has been done by the National Business Initiative. And you can see the red bars on the bottom, which is where we're going to be shedding jobs in the coal value chain and also petrochemicals. But the good news is that, with an aggressive renewable rollout and the minerals for the green economy, we've got really excellent, copper, vanadium, iron and steel are still going to be needed, cobalt, molybdenum, rare earths. We think we can get a net positive jobs impact. But that is going to be unevenly spread, and there are going to be regional impacts that we're unable to mitigate with jobs growth in other parts of the country or other sectors. So we're very actively now engaged in planning for those regional impacts and how to manage this transition process. And there are four broad areas that we're looking at. The one is governance, and we're designing the regional and local development agencies and mechanisms that we need. We're putting in place the mechanisms for public engagement and participation. So not just in the commission that I run, but how do we do this at a regional and a local level, and do it in partnership with regional and local authorities. Also, we're trying to find ways of leveraging in our social partners, particularly the business community, and building on their capacity. And we're extremely interested in mobilizing the funding to drive this. So, there's been a lot of funding into the climate space, mainly for mitigation, a little bit for adaptation, very little for just transition. So we're really working now flat out on the just transition financing mechanisms, and we want to be able to track and measure impact and success. And then there are a whole range of labor market interventions that we're working on. So, how do we create the skills for the labor force of the future? So where is the labor force going to be in 2030, 2040, 2050? And what's the skills pipeline we need for that? What are the employment incentives and the job placement schemes that we need to put in place for that transition? How do we support small and local businesses? Because that's where they're far more labor intensive than some of the large corporates. And how do we prioritize workers for support? Because there are 100,000 workers in the coal sector. Which ones do we focus on immediately? Which ones do we focus on towards 2025 or 2030? And then we're looking at economic diversification measures. So, which are the sectors that we've got to target? What are the tax incentives and other economic incentives that we've got to put in place to drive that? What's the infrastructure we need? Particularly, we're seeing a big play in hydrogen. We already produce quite a lot of grey hydrogen in our economy. We see a big opportunity in green hydrogen in the future. So how do we create the transport infrastructure? I mean, it's very difficult to move around, and also the export machinery and the infrastructure and the ports for that. And then, of course, we don't want this all to be driven by, established white-owned businesses. For us, economic empowerment is key to this process. So how do we involve local and black-owned businesses? And then, lastly, there's some workers that, we're not going to be able to find employment, or coal workers and coal truckers who, might be in their 50s and, are unlikely to be able to be transitioned into new jobs. So there we're actively looking at the types of welfare and unemployment support we've got to put in place. We're having a very active debate now around income support and a basic income grant. We're also having to debate the period of income support. So, how long is this? How do we factor it into our fiscal planning? And what's the age cutoff for early retirement mechanisms? So, and all of these areas are, I can tell you, very active debates. We don't have, I'm not coming to you with a set of answers in each of these areas. This is what's being put together in the framework that I mentioned earlier. So this is my last slide. This feeds into a broader repositioning that's happening around the climate agenda in South Africa. We've traditionally seen it very much as an environmental agenda, and we've got fairly good mitigation and adaptation planning around it. What's happening far more is the economic ministries are much more involved in the debate. We're having a very active engagement around, can we afford this macroeconomically? What's the trade and industrial and labor market policy we need? How do we get the financial regulations and the climate risk disclosure moving? How do we tweak the carbon pricing and the tax policy that we've got? What's the whole public finance strategy around this? And how do we link that to the social development agenda and our social safety nets and HRD strategy? So it's really interesting times. I mean, we've seen the climate agenda now become really a core economic issue in the country, and that's good. In some respects, for the environmentalists, they're feeling like they've got to now refight the argument with a whole range of economic and social and development ministries. But what is happening is that it's mainstreaming climate into the core development strategy of the country. So just closing words from my side, we would love to keep an ongoing engagement with yourselves. We're partners in this. We're up against, a common set of geopolitics. We need to be coordinating closely as we move forward with this transition, and we really value these opportunities to engage. So thank you very much.